Hello everybody, welcome to another edition of Scotland at 7. I'm Gordon Ross. My guest this evening is actually a person I have met before on social media but never had him as a guest in the studio, and that's Gary Paterson. Gary is a political activist. Welcome to the show, Gary. Thanks for coming along this evening.
Thanks for having us.
We have a number of pretty major things to discuss this evening, and I think the first one and the most important of them all is Boris Johnson's demands that the European Union back down and reopen the Brexit negotiations. Now, Gary, what do you think of this? Boris Johnson, can he really persuade the European Union to reopen negotiations, or is this all bluster as usual?
I think it's all bluster. I think it's a lot of buying time as well at the moment. I think they've more or less recognised that there's not going to be any further movement on this, and the main focus at the moment, I think, is preparing for a no-deal Brexit. I think the vision for the UK economy is to move towards a low-wage, low-tax Singapore-style economy. So I think at the moment there has been a lot of effort to play up all of the negotiation with Brussels, but I don't see a lot of movement. I think the EU 27 have been quite resolute in saying that this is the negotiated position, because if we remember from the start of this whole process was that the EU said these are your red lines and these are the only things that are physically possible if you have these red lines. Now, the negotiations could be passed, things could change, but that would mean the UK needs to change its red lines on things like the place of the Court of Justice within the EU for handling things like disputes on trade, things like citizens' rights and freedom of movement. If all of those things are off the table, as we've seen with the quite appalling proposals from Priti Patel and others in the last few days, then there is going to be no change. So we're still in the same position that we've been in since 2016, where the UK is trying to get something that is impossible and then showing surprise that it's not getting what it wants. It's been made very clear time and time again that it's arguing for something that's not compatible with basic reality.
Well, various commentators today in the press have been pointing this out, actually, that this is politics in the UK at the moment is about shifting the blame. And in this case, shifting the blame from the UK government onto the European Union. It strikes me, having talked about this repeatedly for the last 3 years, that nothing has changed, really. That the Brexit deal that Mrs May negotiated was the only kind of Brexit deal that we can get. Because, as you pointed out, we actually set the red lines for ourselves. So, I say we, I mean the British government, of course. And so Boris Johnson really painted himself into a corner here.
You know, it's not just in the last few years. This is really just a continuation of Britain's arrogance within Europe over the last 40 years. And it's that kind of have your cake and eat it approach. You know, we want the economy side, but we don't want the social side or the right side. And I don't mean that as us. I mean, that's the establishment's attitude. That's the UK's position now that is lurched to this extremity. But it's merely a continuation of that there's this idea that we can somehow have all the benefits of the trade, but that we don't have to, treat fellow citizens as human beings, that we don't have to actually support people when we don't have to be part of, of a collection of European states, that we want to basically be on the outside of that without accepting our responsibilities.
So in other words, we want to play the game, but we don't want to play by their rules. But we want to play it and we want to win all the time.
And of course,
we just don't accept the rules.
Of course, we live in a very conservative focused political environment down south as well, and they have been looking more towards Washington than they have been looking towards our European partners, and that's one of the issues as well, is that they want to have this very neoliberal style economy which is not in fitting with the rest of Europe. You know, that's destroying our healthcare service, that's charging these exorbitant £9,000 a year tuition fees, etc. The student debt bubble, for example, it's grown in America. That's something that our political establishment are looking towards and saying we prefer this model of delivery rather than the European model, which is based on solidarity.
A lot has been made actually over the fact that, first of all, none of the people in the Conservative Party who are making these policies and who are deciding the future of the United Kingdom outside of Europe will in any way be affected by any of this financially, because they live in a rarefied atmosphere that's so wealthy that they can basically look down from their ivory towers while the rest of us are squabbling over bread. and fuel and having blackouts and running out of medicines. Do you really think that they would go this far?
But that's always been the case. When it comes to the austerity that we've lived under over the last decade, a decade of austerity that is tearing the fabric of society apart, that of course is not affecting those at the top. The experimentations of the Tories on Scotland back in the 80s with the poll tax, of course, didn't affect them as well, because they barely consisted of Scottish politicians, and this goes right back in history as well. So it is no surprise. Now, there will be effects for the establishment, but at the same time, we do see a lot of people making a lot of money off of this, and there's disaster capitalists who are banking on the country falling apart, because ultimately the UK's model is that we need to build up London and have that as our financial services industry, and that'll keep the country semi-afloat. Whatever's happening outside of that, we'll just kind of work it out and deal with it. And I think that's the economic reality that we already live under, and that will just be made even worse when it comes to Brexit. So whilst things are going to get worse, it will still, I think the political strategy will say we just try to bed in the Singapore-style model. The idea effectively is let's turn London into Singapore.
Much has been made of this Singapore-style economy, and my understanding of this is that the UK government is wanting the whole country basically deregulated, so it plays no part in any of the regulations in Europe whatsoever. But coincidentally, it's not going to have to pay an increase in pensions, which was being demanded by the EU, or take part in the antitrust legislation, which was going to prevent much of the money laundering and the tax evasion that the City of London seems to be surviving on these days. Is it a coincidence that Brexit's happening now, or do you think that this has been on the cards for a long time?
There's a lot of minimum standards that's based on things like the concept of having a social provision in society. What the Americans call things like European healthcare and European education, European welfare state, and this is not in keeping with the current extreme neoliberal agenda that's been pursued by the Conservatives. But being under a European framework, they've had to be, to some extent, they've had to be restrained. And we're seeing now that we're talking about coming out of the EU that they're effectively wanting to turn London into a tax haven. And of course, that's not going to have any benefits, not just to Scotland, but to many of those communities that were actually disenfranchised in the past that caused them to vote. I'm talking about the post-industrial communities in England and in Wales. These are the communities that have been forgotten about, and that will continue. It's only going to get worse. It's going the crisis, I think, the political, socio-economic crisis that we're facing, it is being deepened as a result of Brexit.
I got the impression, based on a number of things that have come out of the UK government in recent months, that the plan is post-Brexit for London to separate itself virtually from the rest of the country and become almost like a city-state, and for these so-called free ports to be set up around the fringes of the coastline, which would allow companies to come into the United Kingdom, set up in these so-called free ports where they don't pay any taxes at all, and manufacture things there and export them from our shores without paying a single penny in tax. Where the rest of us, what do we do? That has never been, I think, answered by any of the Conservatives in this grand plan. It seems that we're to be left to fend for ourselves.
Yeah, well, as I said to you just a moment ago, it is basically the current reality, which is London-centric, which is City of London-centric, if you actually think about it. And that means that the people that are outside of the financial centre, even within London, is, to hell with them, basically, is the attitude. And Grenfell's a good example of that. So it's a very establishment building plan for down in a very exclusive part of London, and then the rest, just let them kind of get on with it. And it's obviously something that we really need to oppose. And for us, we have the opportunity in Scotland. We've got the lifeboat, which is the independence option, and that's something that we need to take. We see the attitude that the UK's got to Ireland in this, where they're saying that they're trying to punish Ireland, and this is going to be one of their approaches. Yet the Irish economy, whereas back in like the 1950s or something, 70% 70% of their exports went to the UK. Now it's 11%, and the UK is actually sending more exports to the UK, to Ireland. And it's important.
I believe it's something like 40% of our food exports go to Ireland.
Looking at the position that Ireland's in which it's facing this solidarity from the rest of the 27, who are prepared to block a trade deal unless these questions are answered, who are in a more economically advantageous position, and of course they're not democratically forced to, their democracy is not held at hostage like ours and forced to accept something they don't want. That's obviously something that we should be looking at and saying we want a bit of that.
There's been this leak of government papers this week that say that a no-deal Brexit would cause incredibly serious economic harm, including food shortages, fuel shortages, medical shortages as well. I mean, these are fundamental things for people that they can't live without. And given the fact that we've already seen the breakdown of the national grid in England recently because two relatively small power suppliers went offline, it seems a very, very fragile country at the moment in terms of how resilient it would be to something like this. Many months ago, I tried to warn people that we were heading towards a kind of almost a police state if this happened, that they would put troops on the streets, they would bolster the police force, and they would build larger prisons for us. And they're doing exactly that, 20,000 more police and 10,000 more prison places being proposed by Boris Johnson. It looks like they're really serious about these clampdowns, and they are expecting there to be trouble.
Well, the first thing to remember as well, and again, this all leads back into this neoliberal model that they've been following over these decades, and the fact that we don't have the resilience is because we have said that basically we're a service-based economy, that people work in supermarkets and on the high street, which is also dwindling, and that the main income for the country is not going to be through things like manufacturing, it's not going to be through the things that other countries in Europe defended during the 80s and the 70s when we were decided to let these industries die, and we're just going to focus on the financial services sector in London, paid for by Scottish resources in the main part. And what that effect has meant is that we are a net importer of food. We don't actually make a lot of the things that we need to sustain ourselves as a country. So if we move towards a model which is what they say, here we go, WTO, that actually means that you have to be very self-reliant until unless you create a trade imbalance where there's no income from exports. If you just say we're not going to charge anything and we're not going to put any tariffs on outgoing or ingoing, that means that the government then doesn't have resource to then spend on things like the welfare state, healthcare, etc. So this Singapore style model is extremely dangerous for our country because it will actually have a huge effect on whether or not the government has the capacity to function because it won't have its resource. And yeah, in terms of the stuff with policing, we've already seen it. Police Scotland have set aside a £7 million contingency budget.
7 billion?
7 million, I said, yeah.
Was it 7 million?
No, it would have
I'm
been.
just checking.
In this political climate, you wouldn't be surprised of anything. But, it does show you that they're obviously, whilst they're a Scottish force, they're part of the whole UK network of contingency planning and stuff. So if they are setting that budget aside in a country within the UK that's expected to be much less of a politically difficult environment, it really leads you to wonder what's happening in other parts of the country where it's a much more contentious issue, where the population is very much divided. So it is a very concerning proposition that we are moving towards this lack of resilience within our country, and we're also moving towards this more kind of potentially authoritarian approach.
One of the comments I heard today online, which I thought was interesting, an interesting observation, was somebody who suggested that when Priti Patel came out and suggested that she would put the pension age up to 75, I think people's jaws dropped open when that story broke. And the comment I heard, which I think is an interesting take on it, was the suggestion that this might be a deliberate policy by the Tories to try to lose a general election before Brexit happens. Is it possible that the Tories are playing to lose? Is this like the Producers, the famous movie where they make the world's worst musical and hope that it fails?
It does leave you wondering. Look, I think for people of my age as well, we have this told to us often that there's not actually going to be a pension when you retire. Ergo, there won't be any retirement. I think it's a very concerning proposal, especially given the fact that as a result of the same party's decades of mismanagement and miscare towards our country, that the pension age is being suggested to be at the level of life expectancy in places, like some of the most deprived communities in our country. So this is very concerning. In terms of why they're doing it, I don't know if they're playing any political games or, I think to some extent they generally, both of the establishment parties have been talking for a long time about how to bring down like the pensions budget, and that's something that I think people of my generation do expect to be challenged in our lifetimes and have like the rights of the pensions that I'm paying into national insurance at the moment. Like I'm apparently paying towards my pension,
yes.
And that pension won't be there for us when we go to retire.
It's always going to be tantalising, like out of reach.
Yeah.
And not only but if you do actually manage to get it.
And we shouldn't accept that. I'm saying that as young people right now, and even of older generations, we shouldn't accept this attack on the right to have dignity at the end of your life. The right to retire is, we work all of our lives. Some people, they work in really hard manual labour jobs. So you're going to have an 80-year-old guy walking around, 74-year-old guy, bringing Amazon parcels up to the 5th floor in your building. Yeah. It's absolutely ridiculous, and they shouldn't be allowed to get away with it. And this is one of the areas where we need to get better at. Actually, we talk about a cross-generational divide within politics, that generally the older generation are voting a different way than the younger generation. This is one issue that we need to tackle on and say, these attacks on pensions, it's not just in the long term, it's in the here and now as well. You
say the older generation, but the calculations were showing that anybody born after 1961 will be affected by these new pension moves. Exactly. And that includes me, because I was born in 1961, but I was born in August. So that puts me just inside the zone where, I'm 58, so I would have been expecting to get my pension in about 9 years. They've now just moved that to 18 years away.
If we got a prelude for our situation to see how this is playing out, we only need to look at the WASPE campaign, the wonderful campaign that those women are doing. But the issue, this has been going on for so many years now, and they're very determined to continue pushing that. So I think that has to be front and centre in our campaigning, is to say that we want a state that is obviously more democratic. We want a country that's based on like social solidarity, and when that comes to pensions, to say that we want a safeguarded pension, we want to ensure that people can retire with dignity.
Well, we've certainly done that to death then. Okay. Well, pressure is growing for the recall of Parliament. 100 MPs have written to Boris Johnson demanding that he recall Parliament immediately to deal with this emergency. But I guess the political pressure on Boris is to do the opposite to that, to hang on as long as possible and to try and delay things. What do you think he'll do?
Yeah, this is very ironic that this is the man who would stand in front of a bus that says "Take back control," with all these signs about promoting democracy in the UK. I think we've seen since 2014 that the so-called UK democracy doesn't really stretch as far north of the border as here. But they're obviously terrified of having the democratic institutions of the UK actually having a say in their process. They'll try to hold it off as much as possible, I think, until we get down to a point where it comes to Brexit. And of course, one of the final things that they have been mooting as well is that perhaps they can pull out of the EU prior to the Parliament actually returning, and that's something that there's a question there about.
You mean actually accelerate it so it happens before the 31st?
And there's a question about that as to whether or not they could just turn around.
Is that actually feasible?
Well, the extension that was granted by the European Council was up to the 31st of October, but the UK could turn around and say, right, well, we can see that there's not going to be a deal here, so we're leaving now. I'm not sure that will actually happen, but there's a lot of game playing going on down there, and that's one of the things that could happen, and this is what's being challenged in the courts. So you think this
might be the way that Boris fights back against all these attempts to oust him, because we've got Jeremy Corbyn asking other party leaders to support him as the interim Prime Minister, in a temporary caretaker government, which would have the sole purpose of avoiding a no-deal Brexit. Now, it doesn't obviously stop Brexit, does it? This is a very interesting distinction. I don't think people understand that stopping no deal doesn't mean we're stopping Brexit, does it?
Well, the first thing that needs to happen, if at any point we're intending to not leave the EU on the 31st of October, that needs to be taken to the other 27 member states of the EU. We need to have the approval to extend the deadline. Now, the original deadline was actually mooted to be the 31st of December 2020, and that has been that was actually opposed by France, because a lot of European citizens and countries, they're basically sick of it, in the same way that we are in Scotland. Like, we're sick of basically the rest of the UK and predominantly the UK establishment to decide what they're actually doing, and they keep stringing it along and playing these different kind of debates. So any of these different options, that's going to need to happen. It's very interesting though, because to see some of the approach that's been taken by some of the parties, Joe Swinson in particular with Lib Dems, has tried to make it about some domestic politics, and I think the number one priority, of course, should be removing the Tories from number 10 and trying to instill some level of sanity back into the political system. But I don't have a lot of hope for that at the moment.
Okay, well, I think Joe Swinson probably has got less chance of doing anything to affect this process than anybody else, considering her party is no longer the third largest party in Westminster. The SNP is.
Well, I think we're starting to see the kind of Ruth Davidson effect, but down in the UK, and I think Joe's like the kind of last hope really for this.
Well, she's trying. I'll say that for her.
Quasi-progressive politics where they want to pretend that they're progressives, but their voting record actually shows that they supported the whole political calamity that got us to this point, include actually enabling the Brexit referendum to happen in the first place.
I know Joe Swinson very well. I know politics because she actually is my MP at the moment, unfortunately for me. However, I was going to bring up the subject of the SNP's response to all things that are going on at Westminster, and Ian Blackford, the chairman of the SNP's Westminster group, has said that, well, he's called for MPs of all parties to work together to prevent a no-deal Brexit. And if I recall correctly, the arithmetic of Parliament at the moment is that there is a majority against no-deal. And so if there were a general election, if they could stop fighting for 5 minutes, there is a possibility of unseating Boris Johnson if they can agree a caretaker government and who might lead it. But do you think, I've read a lot of stories today about Corbyn and the Labour Party, but they're unable to establish a policy on whether they would be neutral in Brexit, whether they would be anti-Brexit, pro-Brexit, or something else. The Labour Party just seems to be unable to decide what it wants to do.
They're all over the place on this and so many other issues, and it's not just been since 2016. The Labour campaign during the EU referendum wasn't exactly the most inspired or active campaigning that I've ever seen in my life. If Corbyn does seek to put himself forward as Prime Minister, there's a huge question of how many Labour MPs would even vote for him to actually take office. I think that's quite extraordinary that those party members would actually risk not going into government. I don't think we've ever seen this happen in politics before. So again, it just shows you the really bizarre political climate that we're under. But all of the game playing that's happening from all the different sides, I think the SNP approach has been the right approach to say, we need to get on with move away from the kind of political game playing down in Westminster and be very aware of the deadline that's hurtling. We're hurtling towards the 31st of October, and within that time, Parliament has very, very little time in which it's actually sitting. It's days. There's not a lot of time, so it's very important that this issue is tackled. And the main thing to say is if the SNP's approach is to try and stop Brexit from happening if possible, but if that's not going to be the case, then we need to have our own opportunity to get out of this mess.
I was saying this earlier on myself today on social media that no matter what happens about no deal Brexit, there has to be an independence referendum, because Brexit is still going to go ahead in some form or other, and none of it will be good for Scotland.
Yeah.
But adding more fuel to the fire of Brexit, as if it needed any, again, is the Home Secretary saying that the free movement of European citizens will end on Halloween if there's a no-deal Brexit. This again seems to be more saber-rattling, more threats from the UK if the European Union doesn't toe their line and kowtow to the British exceptionalism. Is there any chance that the European Union would feel in any way intimidated by this kind of threat?
Well, to some extent, it is. It could be a threat, but I think it is something that they actually do believe in. Priti Patel is on the extremist side of the right wing in the Tory party. Like, she and her colleagues that are now running the government with Boris. They have a very strong neoliberal anti-immigration agenda. So I do believe that it's something that they believe in and that they want to see. Whether or not it goes ahead is another question. As part of the 2-year transition period that was agreed, and as as a deal, I think there would have been some agreement on something like freedom of movement. But it's just another example of showing us what we're facing, as a result of being stuck in the UK, which is a kind of sink in Britain, that we are having our rights, our opportunities taken away from us, and that it will have an impact on us going abroad. Of course, it also has an impact on things like our health service, on our care sector, where we have EU citizens that are actually living, working and studying on our university sectors as well. Like, it's not something that they should be gambling with, but we've seen through the past that it's something that, of course, to be prepared to.
We're already beginning to see the dangers of Brexit in Northern Ireland, with the police service of Northern Ireland saying that their officers were targeted in an Irish border explosion. I think it was yesterday, when they were called to deal with a suspicious or suspected explosive device. And it later turned out that it was a hoax. But while they were investigating the hoax, another device went off.
Yeah.
And so this has obviously been timed very carefully by, presumably by Republican dissidents who were not prepared to go along with the Good Friday Agreement. And I think this is them beginning to show themselves and say, look, there's going to be trouble if you put a border across Ireland.
I think it's important to remember as well that there could be trouble on any side of that debate over there, and I think you mess with the hard-won peace at your peril, and we have taken it for granted, particularly my generation, and I have friends out there in Northern Ireland, and they say they've never known it any other way. It was a hard-won peace, and the whole Brexit process, it should never have even been allowed to have occurred without actually thinking through what the impact would have been. Yeah. And people, even like on both sides of that political debate in Ireland, they've been absolutely let down by the UK because there's been absolutely zero care or consideration for what they're facing. But reading those comments, particularly myself, I thought it was quite alarming. And what was concerning about it was I was thinking how quickly this could become normalised, how soon that you can actually start to read those comments, and for it to not feel like you're reading an article from decades ago, but that it's actually current affairs. And that's the real risk here. Like,
it seems very obvious from this event, with this explosion targeting PSNI officers, that the men, I'm assuming the men or maybe women behind this explosion, are sending a powerful message that they're not prepared to have the Good Friday Agreement messed with by the UK. They're not prepared to have it trashed by Brexit. My memory of the Good Friday Agreement, or the Belfast Agreement, tells me that the Republic of Ireland gave up its sovereignty in exchange for which the British government offered to give the people of Northern Ireland a border poll if they were unhappy at remaining under British rule. Now, this strikes me as being almost exactly a fulfilment of that particular condition. How unhappy are they? We're not hearing anything from Northern Ireland in the news. Is there a blackout? Do you think?
Well, there's 2 points there. On the last point, I think is very important actually, and this would have played probably a factor in the whole debate when it came to Brexit if what happens in Northern Ireland is actually regularly reported in the UK media, and it's not, frankly. If you actually read RTE, you'll find out more about what's going on in Northern Ireland than you'll find out from BBC or elsewhere.
Or if you read the Irish Times, sometimes.
As an aside, people, particularly like in the rest of the UK, like the question of the Irish border has never been a thought, and the Brexiteers have absolutely zero interest or thought on that topic. Now, in terms of the right to hold a border poll, that's stated. I believe that if there's a showing through, or I think at least the practice around it is that if there was a showing in opinion polls of a movement towards reunification with Ireland, if that had gone into the majority, then it's down to the Secretary of State of Northern Ireland to say that they've recognised that and can call it. But I think as well, under the devolution settlement, that if one of the two sides of government were to bring that forward and say, we are representing this interest within the population, and not just leaving it down to the Secretary of State, but saying that there is a public will and a call for this. But the polling that did come out today showed something like about 58%, I believe, of people in Northern Ireland believing that there should at least be a delineation when it came to the attachment to the single market, so the idea of the backstop, having the border down the Irish Sea. Sure. That is something that's actually been supported by the majority, and the DUP have basically said, well, we don't recognise that outcome.
But the DUP are in the minority because although they're the largest party and won the first past the post seats, they're actually less than a third, I think, of the actual political...
Well, as we've seen with so many issues, from the budget to equal marriage, they've managed to hold that area. They've held them hostage, and using things like they have the ability to block certain laws if there's a conscience clause, basically, and they've used that for just general policies.
They use religion as a weapon.
It's just their whole approach is very problematic, and I really feel for people who live in Northern Ireland who are potentially having a very disruptive and scary political climate being forced on them. It's horrible, and hopefully there is that we don't fall to this brink. But again, as I said earlier, I think it's extremely concerning how easily it could slip back into normality, this kind of conflict that we're seeing.
I wonder sometimes actually if that is not exactly what the DUP is hoping, because to my mind, having watched and listened to the DUP for several months, they appear to me to be very similar to the zealots in Margaret Atwood's novel The Handmaid's Tale, the Gilead sort of religious organisation, which is very tough on women. It's very misogynistic, and it disapproves of virtually everything. And it seems to be a backward step for the people of Northern Ireland to have them actually representing them. I need to move us on from this now. We've certainly done Brexit a great deal of service this evening. But moving on, okay. Now, there is a story today which has caused a great deal of anger, particularly amongst independent supporters, and that is a story that the Electoral Commission recommended six months between the completion of legislation and polling day. This is for an independence referendum and can include 12 weeks, they recommend, to assess the wording of a question. Now, the media report made it sound as if the Electoral Commission was jumping on there with both feet and saying that any new independence referendum had to go through them and they had to approve the question and it was going to take weeks. In actual fact, we have a statement from Sarah Mackay from the Electoral Commission, and she has said that they were very satisfied with the question they used in 2014. Yes and no was rejected for the EU referendum because due to the fact that testing people in the UK, many of them didn't actually realise the UK was in the European Union in the first place. But in Scotland, of course, everybody knows the difference between yes and no. We know the difference between the Union and independence. And changing the question, do you think that there is any need to change the question if there's an independence referendum?
Well, I think the first thing to mention as well is that the comments from the Electoral Commission were actually in relation to the referendum bill, which is talking about all referendums. So whilst obviously the next independence referendum is probably going to be the key outcome of that bill, that's a bill that sets the standard for referendums in general, and that's not just Scotland-wide, that could even be at a city level. So I think that's one point that's worth bearing in mind. Of course, the Electoral Commission are going to say that they want to be involved in any democratic process. Like that's their job. That's what they're there for.
Oversee it, don't
and
they?
Exactly.
They help to formulate the question, but they don't set it.
I think also we only have to look at polling that they use at Scotland and Union, and they already start to conflate this idea of like Remain leave within the Scottish political context.
They're trying to
conflate the issues. I think I'm not saying that that's the Electoral Commission, but there are some, and I think we will see from the campaign that will be established when we have the referendum that they're going to try to first of all force us to leave Europe, but also at the same time use the positive language of Remain that has been denied to us.
I think Pamela Nash is probably behind all of this from Scotland and Union. She said a few things today.
The one thing I think is really important to highlight when it comes to this, right, is that the discussion of yes, no, that is part of our political language. It was the case in the 1970s in the referendum for devolution, in the 90s as well, 2014.
I was pointing out to somebody just the other day that the no campaign won with the negative fear campaign, so they've got nothing to complain about, surely.
But also in 2014, we had a 85% turnout, biggest ever turnout that we've had for that kind of referendum, and we are still in this discussion and debate, partly because of the failure of the UK to honour its position in 2014, that we're still discussing things on the terms of yes, no. So I think this kind of idea that we might try to game the outcome by changing the rules is wrong. And if you look at political polling since before 2014 and since, there's a reason it follows the question, because that's the question that's been set. And the terms of debate are the same. So I don't see any argument for changing it.
The Electoral Commission approved the question, actually modified the first question so that it was fair and easy to understand.
Yeah.
And they remain happy with it, according to their statement today. And we actually have a little video coming up here of the reaction to this contradictory scaremongering row from Derek Mackay.
Well, it appears that many forces of unionism have conceded that Scotland should have a referendum on independence. Of course, we believe that it should be for the Scottish Parliament to decide. It should be the Scottish people that decide. But of course, we will have a referendum held to the highest possible standards, and one that can inspire the people of Scotland. Not just the process of the referendum, but why we need independence, and that's becoming all too clear.
So there we go. We have Derek Mackay there, basically echoing what you and I have just been saying about this whole contradictory media scaremongering session today. Now, also on the back of Derek Mackay answering this question, he also has been chairing the new board, which has met for the first time to discuss the future of Ferguson Marine. And again, we have another video clip from Derek today, hopefully coming up in a moment.
Here at Ferguson's in Port Glasgow in Inverclyde, where the Scottish Government has intervened to achieve our objectives, which are to complete the vessels currently under construction, to safeguard the workforce, and also to give the shipbuilding yard here a future. Today I have chaired and convened the inaugural Programme Review Board, which will look at the necessary work and expertise that is required to complete the vessels under construction that CalMac require. I'm looking forward to the weeks and months ahead to set out the cost analysis and also the timetable that will inspire people to have confidence that we will achieve the objectives that I've set out.
So there again we have Mr Mackay's opinions also on how Ferguson Marine will move forwards. Now, this is the first time, I think, for decades that shipbuilding in Scotland has been back in public hands. I think the last time I remember that was Upper Clyde Shipbuilders back in the 1970s. So how important do you think it is for the Scottish Government to safeguard shipbuilding, civilian shipbuilding in Scotland at the moment?
Yeah, I think it's hugely important, and it is, it's a great part of our manufacturing history, like as a nation, as a city as well, just outside of Glasgow. We were told in 2014 that if you vote no, that shipbuilding was not just going to be saved but flourished, and that obviously has not been the case. And it isn't ironic that the government that actually argued that we should have independence because that was not the case has now had to step in and use its resource to back up a promise that was actually made by the No campaign that this wouldn't be an issue. So again, it's just another kind of item on the list of the kind of betrayal like of 2014. But I think it's hugely important, and as I talked earlier on about the decision that was taken in the UK to let industry die back in the kind of challenges in the 80s and stuff, and that position wasn't taken in Europe in the general. It was decided that the government has to step in and try to save the jobs, and we see the difference. And what's happened is that you look at a country like Germany, where they saved all their industry that was being challenged, and at the moment now they have a great manufacturing industry. I was on the train in Germany going past and seeing train wagons with hundreds of VW cars on them, and thinking you don't see that in the UK. So I think it's hugely important, and I hope that style of economic intervention is something that would characterise how we approach the risk to jobs before and after independence.
But one of the reasons I asked this question is because Ferguson Marine, unlike a lot of shipyards, is a small, highly specialist company. And they're called Ferguson Marine. I think engineering was the name they used to have. Mm-hmm. But Ferguson Marine is actually capable of manufacturing almost anything that goes in the sea, including, as I was pointing out this week, tidal energy devices, particularly like the one which is now about to be manufactured, which has been tested in, near Orkney. And it's been producing megawatts of power for the whole of the year. It's so successful, they are going to start manufacturing hundreds of these machines. And it struck me that the best place to build something like that was a small specialist marine engineering yard, just like the one we have in Port Glasgow. So, if you as a country, you own the means of production for your own energy devices, and you own the means of production for your own ferries, you're pretty much a one-stop shop. You're a supermarket for whatever you need, and there is no gap between client and provider as there is with private industry normally. And we don't get these mismatches where a ship is ordered at a certain price and the manufacturer's unable to make it at that price because the customer keeps asking for changes. Somebody who, I cannot remember the name of this person, said to me, I don't know if this is true, that it was British government changes to regulations, marine regulations, which were enforced and placed upon this order. And we have, there's a little bit of information here about the company CMAL, which was created by the Scottish Government in order to create the design specifications for these ships. And a board has been set up to determine a new delivery schedule by the end of October. And Derek Mackay has obviously chaired this meeting. Now, he said he's always been clear that he wants to complete the vessels and secure the jobs and give the yard a future. So obviously that's the first and foremost task of this board. So they have to review the delivery schedule and look at the revised costs and figure out whether or how to build these ships without incurring too much more cost. But I suspect that this exercise of taking into public ownership may become permanent, because I think this is a strategic asset, and following independence we need all the strategic assets we can get, preferably under our own control. Do you think this is, bringing back public ownership in this scale is important for constructing a new country?
one of the huge opportunities that we have after independence is utilising, harnessing our huge environmental resource. And within the North Sea, we've got so much of Europe's wind and wave potential. We have a vast share of that potential. And to utilise that, we do need to rebuild our industry. And there's no reason why we can't do it. Other countries do have it. As I was saying to you, like when you're travelling through Europe, you do see factories, you actually see manufacturing activity on the ground. You can witness it on the train tracks literally, and we don't see that here to that degree, and I think it's going to be a huge focus.
Yards like Bifab should be bustling with business at the moment, except that all of the orders for wind turbine jackets and things like that are going to foreign companies for some reason. So to me at least, I mean, I'm an old socialist at heart, I see the public ownership of these massive engineering concerns to be of vital importance, because we, as you say, need to be far more self-reliant in the new world order that's coming out of this current chaos. And in order to survive, we need to be able to manufacture the things that we need
and make use of of our skills, of our heritage. We have a great heritage in manufacturing, and it's it's still something that people want to work in. It's something that there's a need in the world, and when you look at those countries as well in Europe, they're not just building for themselves, they're building for others, and there's absolutely no reason why we can't be doing that as well. The reasons, the rationale and the opportunities, I'm not entirely sure. I think I know it's about saving jobs. There are great opportunities there, as you say, and those need to be front and foremost when we're thinking about how we actually meet the opportunities and capacities that we have physically for our country after independence.
One of the things because I have a strong sort of green interest, that I studied tidal energy as a former engineer, and very quickly realised that because water is 816 times denser than air, it's 816 times more powerful as a medium for driving a turbine. And it's important, I think, just to make sure that the public understand we're not talking about wave energy here. We are talking about the tide that comes in and out each day 4 times. So we have a regular movement of water all around the shores of Scotland every single day, 4 times a day, and you can time it to the second because it goes according to the orbit of the moon. That means that you can phase that power in via an array of these machines, hundreds of them if necessary, and orchestrate it so there's never a lack of power. And when you don't need that extra power, it's either saved in hydroelectric schemes, or it's simply piped ashore to other countries to be used abroad.
We look at the data already. We already actually do meet a lot of our energy requirements as Scotland anyway, with a renewable provision that we've got. And what is so important, and this is actually Brexit has been one of the issues that has sidelined this, is actually how we connect to the rest of Europe, and so that we can actually sell that energy and to actually contribute to this wider need that there is in this huge economic.
Are needed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interconnectors.
And our interconnectability within our country and to other countries, not just the UK, other countries, but other European countries, it's hugely important. And the great opportunities that we have in terms of our not just how we harness our energy, but the economic method in which we spend and grow those economic gains, that's going to be hugely important as well. We really need to look at the North Sea oil model and replicating that, but within this renewable energies, that we have this huge resource that effectively can make a huge amount of money for us, and that we need to do it in a very progressive manner.
I think so. I agree with you, because I believe that the expertise gained from North Sea oil sub-sea operations, building platforms, building wellheads, deep below the sea, the skills that the people who build these structures for the big oil companies have are directly transferable to tidal energy devices. They're almost identical. They're building, big steel machines that work underwater.
When we go back to what we were talking about earlier with the kind of economic model and outlook for the UK, once the oil runs dry, and I think that's a long ways off, but also there's a political imperative to move from oil. But once
environmental imperative,
that's
as well,
what I mean.
More.
But once oil is no longer going to be the main economic model for that part of the country, I hope that this prediction doesn't come true, because I hope that we move out of the UK before then. But the people that are working in those industries in that part of the country, they'll be forgotten just like Ravenscraig, and we'll go down that same path. So we now need to be arguing for a different political model for climate reasons, for economic reasons, and also for the people that are working in those industries, for that part of the country, for those communities. We need to be fighting for something that's going to give them a future as well. So we need to be looking to what the risks are down the line as well. And again, that's a message in terms of our movement. Just as we're talking with pensions with the older generation, we need to get really clear to say that this boom is already, we're starting to see contractions within that part of the country in Aberdeen, there's been difficulties with that sector. We need to be very clear to say that we have a solution for
a switch over from oil to green.
And given it a long term, and there's no time limit when it comes to this kind of stuff, because
it's interesting that both Shell and BP are starting to invest in renewables offshore now themselves, so they must be seeing the writing on the wall, I think.
The word is finite. It's a finite resource, and we want an economic model for your families, for your communities, that's not based on finite, because that makes it a finite.
We can't continue to burn hydrocarbons
that
at the rate we're doing either.
What your livelihood is based on a finite economic model. We want to move away from that, I believe.
Yeah. Okay, let's move along to the next story, and that is again it's kind of following the oil theme, but this is the Iranian tanker, the Adrian Darya, formerly the Grace. It was renamed the Grace. It was renamed the Adrian Darya the first. It's now been allowed to leave Gibraltar for Greece, but nothing much has been said about why it was detained. That was a suspicion that it was taking its cargo of oil to Syria. And as far as I understand it, they had to give an undertaking that they wouldn't do that. But now it's been released.
Well,
and the Americans are trying to prevent it going any further as well now. So there is this argument going on about whether this ship should be released or not. The European Union is the bloc which has supposedly got this embargo, this trade embargo with Iran, and the UK forces were used to seize this vessel. UK special forces were used to get on board this vessel and bring it to Gibraltar on the basis that it was smuggling oil to Syria. Now they've let it go. That largely begins to look a bit odd that it maybe wasn't smuggling oil to Syria, to Syria at all, that it was in fact just seized for political purposes. To put more pressure on Iran, in other words.
Potentially. There have been some sides of it where I read that it did come in under different flags and name. It was under a Panama flag, under a different name. How normal is that? I have no idea. I'm not an expert in relation to shipping, but they seem to have satisfied the European regulations anyway, and now the debate is about the US are still pushing the issue of detainment. However, the EU response has been that they've met the European standards. So it'll be a question to see how it progresses.
Okay. Moving even further afield now to the Canary Islands, and according to the news, international news feeds at the moment, over 8,000 people have had to flee their homes in the Canary Islands as wildfires have swept across the islands. Now, my understanding is that in the Canary Islands, wildfires do occur in the summer. But what's different apparently this year is a massive heat wave has struck the islands. And the firefighters apparently have had to be stopped from fighting the fire for a while because the conditions were so bad, they couldn't breathe properly and they were becoming exhausted within minutes. And apparently the problem also is that they have to fly 2 large water bomber planes all the way from Spain out to the Canary Islands to do something about it. How on earth did a small island with a limited supply of fresh water manage to contain this?
Yeah, it's hugely concerning, and I think there's obviously another discussion here, but I think even in the first and foremost, there has to be a big think about the capacity within the Canary Islands to deal with such a thing, because all of the indicators suggest that we are moving towards an environment where this is going to be more of a regular occurrence. So it can't be that they have to rely on planes full of water to come from Spain to try and to fix this issue. There's going to need to be some looking at local capacity in terms of dealing with that issue, and that's a lesson that needs to be learnt on the peripheries throughout Europe and globally. That how do those communities and areas that are away from the main urban centres, how do they respond to those issues? So there's lessons, I think, for everyone. But the crux of the issue is that wildfires do happen, but we are operating in an environment where we've got the hottest on record climates. We actually, I was remarking on this thing before, we would talk about climate in these kind of moralistic terms over the last decades, and actually there is an economic attachment to it. There is a cost to people not being able to go to work, to trains. When the Eurostar had to stop and hide in a tunnel because it was breaking down, and they're advising people not to travel on certain days. There's actually a huge risk to public health. There's a huge risk to the economy. Climate change is not just about tackling climate change. It's not just about doing the right thing for the environment. Even if you want to look at a very blinkered and selfish approach and talk about it purely in economic senses, climate change is bad for the economy. It's bad for life. It's
going to cost people. Insurance companies trillions of dollars.
Exactly.
Over the decades.
So even if you don't want to take it from any approach about saving people, etc., which is actually what we should be concerned about, climate change is a disaster for our society, for our country in any measure that you look at it. So this it's another example that the clock is ticking. We need to do something, and it needs to happen now.
The last story this evening, leaving the wildfires now, involves the Queen's second oldest son, Prince Andrew, who I think nobody can really have missed the story in the papers yesterday and today. Prince Andrew has issued, in fact Buckingham Palace has issued a statement which says that Prince Andrew denies any sexual misconduct in Epstein's flat. Now, this is the man who in the United States was accused of being a paedophile and was convicted, and then was later charged with further crimes of trafficking, sex trafficking, so basically importing youngsters from abroad to be used as sex slaves at his parties. Now, Prince Andrew obviously has been friends with this man. Whether he knew about the man's past is up for debate. But certainly Andrew has been tainted by a piece of video evidence which showed up recently, and it dates from, I believe, 2010, and it allegedly shows Andrew at the door of Epstein's apartment after a young woman has left. And this has obviously cast more mud, if it's needed, at Prince Andrew, who now has gone into hiding because of the mental stress, according to the newspapers. Is there any way that Prince Andrew can recover from all these allegations?
Well, I think the first thing to say about the Epstein death, which has happened in quite surprising circumstances, is that of course a lot of young women who were very brave in coming forward and talking about the issues, talking about the abuse that they faced, they will now not receive the full justice that they deserved, that they look likely to get. If there are any questions of the different celebrities and establishment figures that are attached to Epstein, they need to be treated with the kind of respect that you would expect for any case where someone's coming forward and talking about that abuse. And if there are concerns and charges, and I know that there's stuff going through the courts in the US, then they need to be answered to. So the question will remain to see is how they will actually respond in a scenario where he is actually summoned to court. And I think it would be be inconceivable that he would become some sort of, kind of royal pariah who's unable to go to the US or something.
But
in
surely
the way that
he might be a material witness in the case. Even if these allegations are untrue, he might be subpoenaed as a witness. And I don't know if that's ever been done. Has a British member of the royal family ever been subpoenaed
I'm not sure. I don't think so. But
in a trial in the United States?
It would be inconceivable for most people, I think, to think that he would not engage with that process and not be involved in it. I think this idea that he could become some sort of Roman Polanski, where this is the somehow still famous movie director in the US who's still revered amongst celebrities in the US despite being a convicted rapist. The idea that we would allow someone from our political establishment to become some sort of pariah who would never be able to visit the US or something. I think that's inconceivable. So I don't know what response he's going to make because we've not seen it. We've not seen what they're going to say. But I think if there are questions and if there are charges to answer, then of course he needs to answer that, and we need to expect the monarchy and our government to put the rights of abuse victims first before any other considerations about how it would be some sort of national
in this case
problem for us.
In this particular case, it would be very difficult for the UK to accidentally lose files in this particular instance, as they have done in the past. Actually, this came in a week in which there was a story in the press about Lord Mountbatten, the late Lord Louis Mountbatten, who, it appears from unclassified documents, the FBI had a file on him. And the FBI had discovered that Mountbatten he was bisexual for a start, which is not a crime. But this was not really known to the British public at the time. But not only was he bisexual, but he had a voracious appetite for young men, apparently. And this even concerned the American FBI after the war, because they were concerned so much about the appearance of Mountbatten, because he was a war hero. And his reputation was important to both Britain and America, apparently. But this has only just come out recently. Anyway, I think we have run the full gamut of stories for this evening, and I think that's us, Gary, for tonight. We've done everything we can do, and I really must thank you for your very fulsome explanations and comments tonight. Before we finish, just let me remind you that producing television programmes is a very expensive business, and to allow us to continue making programmes for you and to pay the bills for the studio, we need more people to sign up as Broadcasting Scotland supporters. Now, your £5 a month will help us to keep doing that year upon year, forever, if you keep supporting us. So please sign up on our website. You'll see the details on your screen now, www.broadcastingscotland.scot/register. That's it this evening from Scotland at 7. I will be back again on Thursday night in my more usual slot, and I hope to see you then. But from all of us at Broadcasting Scotland and from everybody on the Scotland at 7 team, a very good night to you.